Lecture 3 in Critical Thinking, Philosophy 1290 at the University of Manitoba, Fallacies of Relevance. So last time we talked about what a fallacy is, and now we're going to get into some details about some specific fallacies. Again, the number of fallacies you could make is infinite. We're looking at ones that are so common that it's worth kind of attaching a name to it as a way of identifying it and avoiding it. So we're going to look at 7 in this section, Fallacies of Relevance, and giving you the page numbers of the textbook there as best I can determine without actually having the textbook in hand. And so let's start with a simple one, appeal to pity. The Latin name for this is ad misericordiam, argument from misery. And what's really going on here is the irrelevance. Remember, these are fallacies of relevance. There is a lack of relevance between the premises and the conclusion. So for instance, right now, California is burning down, and we feel terrible about that. Should that compel us to accept any particular political solution or environmental opinion? Should we think the climate change is obviously true because California is burning? I would suggest that there is a lack of relevance between how I feel about how horrible that is and what I should think is true about other things. If climate change is true, then it would be true on the basis of relevant evidence, not on how I feel about the misery of the people and animals in California. So that's a pretty straightforward mistake, substituting your emotional response for reason. Lots of textbooks treat this as in fact our current textbook does, treats this as a subcategory of a fallacy of emotion. Historically, this has been treated as a separate fallacy from an emotional fallacy. Pretty clear that pity is a form of emotion, so you can make a case either way. You could argue historically it's always been treated as its own thing, so let's keep doing that. You could say, hey, let's make it make sense to, if it's an emotion, then it should be a fallacy of emotion. This illustrates my point about these fallacies, that they don't nicely categorize. There is no definitive taxonomy of these things. You have to identify something that makes sense for you. If we want to think about why this is a bad example, why this is not reliable reasoning, I regularly confronted with pretty much something that looks like this in my office at the university, where students, for one reason or another, have come in to talk about how they're doing in the course, and it slowly dawns on them that things aren't going well, and I feel terrible about that, especially when things get emotional. And now, should that affect my reasoning about what the appropriate course of action is? If a student has done no work and is failing the course, should the fact that they're prepared to cry in my office make me more likely to waive university policy? Arguably, there's no relevance between how I feel about, and quite frankly, it's terrible. I feel terrible, but that doesn't have any relevance to how I should act in those situations. Why, and when we do these fallacies, we want to think not only about why it's a bad reasoning, but also why it works. What's the hook? What is the trick in these things? And I call that the persuasiveness of this. And quite frankly, humans are social beings. We care about others. And it's enormously difficult to say no in the face of a compelling emotional argument. Um, I've heard anthropologists argue that when we hear a crying child, we want to leap into action, not because um, we have some rational response, but baked deep into us is this, oh my goodness, we have to help. And so I think it's a deeply part of our humanity that we would respond emotionally in the confrontation of an emotional need. And that's I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. But if you want to know whether that's rational or not, whether that's logical and well reasoned, then you need to be a bit more critical. So not now. In some cases, when you hear a child cry and you realize that it's hurt, the empathetic thing is also the right thing to do. There is a relevance between consoling the child and hearing the child cry. On the other hand, with respect to uh, watching horrible things happen on the news and how we want to maybe lash out at someone locally because of that, less relevant. Next fallacy. This is a little trickier one. Appeal from ignorance. Ad ignorantium is the Latin, and this is of the general form arguing from a lack of evidence for something that thing is therefore false. Now, we need to be careful here. The English descriptive name ignorance um, is not being rude or foolish or stupid. This is ignorant here is lack of knowledge. I'm sure all of the people watching this video are ignorant about, let's say, nuclear physics. And that doesn't mean we're rude or stupid. It means that there is some part of potential knowledge that for us is incomplete. And that's exactly the sense when we say ignorance here. What we mean is no evidence. We're not. So this is not about how people act or whether they're belligerent or not. This is about whether or not there is available evidence. And it's quite natural to think that if there is absolutely no evidence for something, that it can't be true. And so that's exactly what the reasoning is here. Um, I've heard a colleague who will remain nameless once say that Beyonce can't be any good because he's never heard her songs on the radio. And we'll have to come back to that example because there's a lot to unpack there, right? Uh, like what radio station are you listening to, and or do you even have it on? Um, but uh, that's a basic form of this. There is no evidence, therefore something to the contrary. Um, Trump's argument that hydroxychloroquine should be used to treat COVID was largely on the evidence that there is no evidence of negative effects, therefore it's good to go. Whether there was evidence of it actually working, not so much. Now, why is this persuasive? I would argue that not having evidence is a good reason to not believe something. If I have no evidence for X, whatever X is, I should not believe X. It's entirely a bridge too far to say if I shouldn't believe it, then it must be false. So, not having evidence is a good reason to be skeptical or reluctant, but it is not good reason to believe the contrary, to suppose that something must be false because of a lack of evidence for it being true. And I think it's that difference, that's that extra step that feels, quite frankly, sort of natural. What do you mean you have no evidence for this? Why would I believe it? Of course you don't believe it. But do you accept the opposite? No. Okay? So that's the fallacy of ignorance. If you want a strong counterexample, Columbus, when he sailed from Europe to the perfectly found on its own, looking after itself, Americas, um, and only with the arrogance of a European could he presume to have discovered it. But his belief was that there was no evidence that he could not sail directly to China. And of course, that wasn't the case, right? So the lack of evidence was not a reason to believe that there was nothing in the Americas. Fallacy of ignorance is one of those fallacies that tends to cut both ways. It tends to be just as good an argument for as against any particular thing. For instance, in the philosophical question of whether God exists, uh, there's not a heck of a lot of evidence. And quite frankly, the evidence that we do have is secondhand. Um, and so you'll hear people argue both ways. They'll say there is no evidence that God exists, therefore God does not. On the other side of the street, you'll hear someone say there's no evidence that God does not exist, therefore God does. And if you ever hear arguments sort of equally structured and equally compelling for both sides of a story, I would encourage you as a critical thinker to pause and reflect. And also, that's not a bad trick. If you hear an argument and you think, oh, that seems to make a little bit of sense, flip it over in your mind and ask yourself, would it be just as compelling if it was an argument for the alternative point of view? If it is, then you've got some troubles, and it's probably worth further investigation. Just as an example of how you would expect a scientist to treat lack of evidence as opposed to leaping to some conclusion, this is a quote from a very famous paper within the bee research world looking at the causes of CCD or colony collapse disorder. You don't need to know anything about that. I just want you to look at the second bullet point here, which is a scientist using language to confront the reality of lack of evidence. So we have currently insufficient evidence to conclude. Nothing about there's no evidence, so let's go with the opposite, right? There's no evidence, we're not going to conclude anything, okay? And so if you're a good disciplined researcher, that would be the position you would likely take. Next, fallacy, illegitimate authority, sometimes called false authority, ad verecundiam in Latin. And this is when an authority offers evidence or testimony and therefore you conclude it's true. So really what we have is an inappropriate authority offering evidence. What's clearly going to matter here is this word appropriate. Where is it here? There we are. Where sometimes, like if Dr. Fauci says we should wear a mask, that's, I think, a very different thing than if Kanye West says we should wear a mask. I think he's saying the opposite, but let's just suppose that they're saying the same thing. Why do we think Dr. Fauci is the right person to listen to on this? Well, that also to do with the appropriateness, the scope, and the gravitas of their authority. So let's talk about that for a little bit. When is an appropriate authority? When they have expertise that falls within the scope of their qualifications. So when you have the Surgeon General saying smoking is harmful, that seems like evidence that we should accept. This person is in charge of health and is someone who's educated. On the other hand, that same person, if they say Red Bull rocks, party on, right? Do we think the Surgeon General is an expert on which caffeine drinks are most rocking and should be mixed with the most hardened of spirits? You probably don't get to be Surgeon General by doing a heavy partying. So probably their expertise in that area of research should probably be, I think wisely, those of you who are wondering, well, who is this Surgeon General person and why would I care what they say? Exactly, right? They're not relevant to the question of what rocks and what doesn't. So you could easily have the same person be an appropriate authority in one case and an inappropriate authority in another. At least the way I treat this authority, which is that a third person offers evidence, um, that means that false authority doesn't work in the first person. When you offer an opinion, you say, I believe something is true, you're not offering your view as an authority, you're just offering your own opinion. That can get kind of complicated when someone is perhaps an authority. We see, celebrities of various sorts weighing in on matters political or artistic uh, or of matters of social issue, and they, I think, want to occasionally, at least, they want to be heard as an expert when, quite frankly, they're not. Are they committing this fallacy? Um, I don't think so. So if we say, Kanye West says Donald Trump is great, uh, if I say I think Donald Trump is great because Kanye West says so, then I'm committing the fallacy of false authority because Kanye is not an expert on political matters. If, on the other hand, Kanye says in the first person, I think Donald Trump is great, he's offering his own opinion and he's not um, making any terrible mistake. The weirdest of these entirely are when people speak in the third person, and Mr. Trump, lots of times will say Donald Trump doesn't like, and so there he's kind of citing himself as an authority. Um, is that false authority? I, you know, it's clearly a mistake. Whether it's exactly this a fallacy or just being a fool, um, we'll have to take those on a case by case basis. Why is this persuasive? Well, we do rely heavily on authorities for uh, knowledge. No one can know everything. Um, when we go to the doctor and the doctor says, listen, you really need to make some lifestyle changes, you need to take this medicine, you need to have this important medical procedure, uh, we should heed that advice. If, on the other hand, your doctor starts advising you on the shingles for your cottage roof or the horse to bet on in the third race, um, not an authority, right? So we need to sort of compartmentalize all of that, and it's that compartmentalization that probably is why this is persuasive. We don't do that. We're not disciplined enough at doing that. I usually listen to my doctor, so when he tells me about my investment portfolio, I continue listening, even though that's outside of that person's expertise. I really admire my favorite R&B singer, and so when they start telling me about social issues, I keep listening, even though that seems like they're out on a bit of a limb. It's that lack of compartmentalizing expertise versus non-expertise that is, I think, at the heart of why false authority is persuasive. So, for instance, there's Wayne Gretzky telling us, I think probably for 30 years, that Ford is number one. And he's clearly explaining that you should buy a Ford. Sidney Crosby is usually telling us to buy something or other. Clearly, they're using their status as hockey players to encourage us to think like them. And that's an inappropriate authority. Wayne Gretzky is not an engineer. Sidney Crosby is not a nutritionist. Why we should take their advice about these important purchases. if we're persuaded by that, it's because we respect them as hockey players, which is probably not a great way to make our decisions about other things. A really great counterexample for false authority is this person, Jenny McCarthy, who has made something of a career lately for being a spokesperson for vaccine skepticism. And boy, by the end of term, I suspect if we ever do get a vaccine, we'll be hearing plenty more from Jenny. She believes sincerely, I've heard her speak, she believes quite sincerely that vaccines are responsible for the autism her children experience. And I'm not going to say Jenny's wrong about her own personal experience because I haven't walked in her shoes. I don't think they'd fit. But she is not a medical expert. Jenny McCarthy is famous for a few things. Self-exploitation of her own good looks, I guess would be the best way to describe it. But not apart from her own personal experience, which I guess we would call anecdotal, is not an expert on vaccines and continues to advocate for vaccine skepticism, even though a lot of the evidence she cited when she first became an advocate in this issue has since been quite significantly discredited. So, should we accept the testimony of a celebrity about medical issues? I would encourage us to be a bit more disciplined. Argument against the person is the next fallacy. Ad hominem in Latin. For some time, many websites categorize this as the Rush Limbaugh fallacy. Rush is kind of fading into obscurity, but his friend Donald Trump is taking over. So I haven't seen this categorized yet as the Donald Trump fallacy, but I think it's only a matter of time. This is the fallacy of substituting abuse instead of evidence. So this is when you say, why would you think Dr. Fauci is right about vaccines? He's only a little over 5 feet tall. He's short and he's old. Well, that's not really a good reason to not believe Dr. Fauci. Why is this persuasive? I think is because we do rely in our everyday lives on very quick snap judgments about whether we're going to get along with and trust people. We often have people like these high-end poker players that you see on late night TV, or people that work in sales who make very quick judgments about people. And I would argue, in fact, that we're surprisingly good at this, at least in the positive sense. We probably have way too many false negatives, people we think we won't get along with, and therefore either we don't interact with them or we interact with them in a hostile way, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we do often make superficial judgments. I'll make an argument in favor of this. The black and white photo is of President Nixon and President Kennedy. Neither of them were president yet in that debate that is pictured in that photo. Very famous historical example because of the polling that was done after the debate, and at a time when television was a relatively new feature of lives in North America, so that many people listened to the debate between Nixon and Kennedy on the radio and tended to form an opinion that Nixon was the better debater and that he had won the debate and was the better candidate. People who watched on television, according to polling, formed the opinion that Kennedy was a much better debater and was the better candidate. At the time, the remarks made were that, look how superficial people are. just because Kennedy was taller, better looking, well tanned, and whereas Nixon looked like he was extremely nervous and sweaty, um, that we were going to make the judgment about the future of the country based on that. Um, People thought that was pretty superficial. Now, it turns out both of those gentlemen became president in time, and those people who judged Nixon as untrustworthy, they could argue they were vindicated, right? Nixon had to resign in disgrace after the Watergate scandal, after which all subsequent scandals have been named. It's the scandal uh, that set the standard. Um, I would argue that the people who looked at Nixon and said, I don't think he's trustworthy, uh, might have been right in making that judgment. So if you can influence someone's opinion, if you say, Sleepy Joe can't be trusted, he hasn't got the energy. If you can form an opinion, help allow someone to form an opinion based on that's influenced by your abuse, then you have given them evidence that could help them form their conclusion. This fallacy of ad hominem usually breaks down to quite a few subcategories because it's not a good thing about humanity that this is probably the most common fallacy in use. That doesn't reflect too well on us, but for better or for worse, it's so common that we divide it into some subcategories. So there's just straight up abuse. And then it can be the circumstantial fallacy, this is a circumstantial ad hominem or circumstantial abuse, is when the abuse is true or perhaps deserved, but it's not relevant. So when you say Dr. Fauci is short, therefore he can't be trusted about medicine, it's true that he's short, but that's not relevant to whether you should trust him about medicine. The tu quoque or the you too fallacy is really the accusation of hypocrisy that someone can't be trusted merely because they're contradicting themselves. So if my doctor happens to say, hey, Phil, you should lose weight, and my doctor is themselves overweight, that doesn't mean that their advice is wrong. I should still listen, even if they're having trouble heeding their own advice. Hypocrites are, given that they say yes or no to something, are right? If you say yes and then you say no, you are right at least once. And so to disregard something as a hypocrite just because they aren't heeding their own advice would strike me as making a mistake. So does that we humans tend to have very low opinion of people who don't heed their own advice, who are hypocrites. Because if it's something they want us to do, surely they should do it themselves. That's certainly a natural human emotional response, but it is a mistake to ignore someone just because they themselves have at some point contradicted themselves. Fallacy of poisoning the well is the fallacy of preemptive abuse. So you're not going to get specific at all about what some person said. You're just going to say in advance, you can't believe that, today, Donald Trump is calling Bob Woodward a political hack, I believe was the expression I heard on the news. Trump hasn't read the book, probably never will read the book, but he wants you to ignore it. And if he can convince you that Woodward is a political hack, and you ignore Woodward's book, well then he succeeded. Poisoning the well alludes to the process of, say, whether you're invading a town or you're trying to make things miserable. of damaging the water supply, right? So what you need for life, the truth that comes out of that well is poison generally. You're not trying to poison a specific person, you're just making it toxic for everybody. So it's that sort of indiscriminate use of abuse preemptively that is characteristic of that version of the fallacy. I thought it'd be useful to illustrate the various forms here. So I'll walk you through these. And I guess this slide's a little bit dated, referring to the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So we've got Stephen Harper's a control freak, therefore his economic policies are deeply flawed. Okay, I think that's straight up abuse. Stephen Harper is from Calgary. Okay, well, so that's true. So you can't trust his position on the oil sands in Alberta. I would call that circumstantial. Okay, the intended sort of, it's not really an insult, but it's kind of an attack, is true. And you see lots of people. One reason we want to say we have a special name for this is because you have people who will use abuse, and then their defense is, "Oh, I'm just pointing out the truth." Well, you might be, but also your argument still doesn't work. Stephen Harper says we should all rely on private enterprise to stimulate the economy, but his salary is funded by government taxes. So it seems like he's a bit of a hypocrite. You can't believe anything Stephen Harper says. He's just desperate to hold on to power, poisoning the well. Notice the very general character. You can't believe anything. It's not specific at all about what Stephen Harper says. It's just, and then we have the abuse. He's just desperate. Okay, now you think, well, that's a pretty dated example. Let's update it. So we're just going to swap in Justin Trudeau and see if we can make all these examples work. Justin Trudeau is a control freak, therefore his economic policies are deeply flawed. No problem. Okay, now this one we have to change. Justin Trudeau is from Montreal, so you can't trust his position on the oil sands in Alberta. Actually, that still works without even changing the Alberta part, right? Lots of people in Alberta think that anyone from Montreal can't be trusted on oil. Stephen Harper says Justin Trudeau says we should all rely on private enterprise to stimulate the economy. Now, I'm not sure Justin Trudeau has ever said that, but it's certainly true that his salary is funded by government taxes. He would say something a little bit different, probably. That one might need a little bit of work to find something that Trudeau actually said. You can't believe anything Justin Trudeau says. He's just desperate to hold on to power. Works as written. Right? So if you think I'm attacking one side of the fence versus the other, most of these fallacies, and in a way, that's why you know these are fallacies of relevance. They work even when you change who they're about. That's because there's no relevance between the premise, the evidence given, and the conclusion being drawn. If they're not relevant to anything, then of course they work all the time. Couple common errors when we're doing these fallacies is when you draw a conclusion about someone based on their reasoning. So you're ignorant, therefore your arguments are wrong. So then there we have the abuse in the premise, right? The conclusion is the stuff after the therefore. Remember our indicator words, things like thus and therefore tell us here comes the conclusion. So we have premise. You are ignorant, therefore conclusion, your arguments are wrong. I would say that's a form of abuse. On the other hand, your arguments are wrong, therefore you're ignorant. That might not be a good argument, but it's certainly not the fallacy of abuse. And then just straight up abuse, whatever the abuse is, I'll let you fill in the blanks for yourself. Not a fallacy. Remember, fallacies have to be arguments. An argument has to have a premise and a conclusion. So if it's a single straight up statement of abuse or slander, it's not a fallacy. Next fallacy, appeal to emotion. And so here we have in Latin ad populum, which is maybe a bit more specific than emotion is. Sometimes in English called mob appeal. And so, and I think of this as just emotional thinking. Thinking is something is true because it makes you happy. Thinking a certain thing makes me feel good, therefore I think it's true. And let's face it, we all want to feel good. And we all, quite frankly, don't appreciate being lied to. So when someone says something that's false to us, that's a really negative experience. And when we hear something that makes us feel good, well, we feel good. But the relevance between that and its truth is deeply irrelevant. And we know that con men, people who are busy running various scams, bilking people out of their investments, and so on. When you interview the people who are the victims, they inevitably said how pleasant that person was to be around, how complimentary they were, and so on. They're saying lots of things that make you feel good. So you're right. It's good you feel good when you hear stuff that's true. It doesn't work in reverse if you feel good that doesn't make it's true. So watch for that. You want to now. I've defined it sort of in the first person. A lot of people think of this fallacy as being something that happens to groups of people, which is called mass appeal. So that when we have people having an emotional response as a group, so in the way that Americans respond to their memories of 9/11, that is an emotional response that a large group of people have. Many of us might be having that emotional response to things like the wildfires in California or to the terrible deaths of black men at the hands of police. Uh, we've had at a social society level emotional responses to that. Now, are the decisions we're going to make as a result of those emotional responses, are those going to be rational? I'll let you ponder on that on your own time. At best, it's 50-50, I'm afraid. Just backing up a second, counterexample here. So COVID-19 is a hoax. I've had many people say that to me as I've been out and about. And of course, if your reason is that you hate to wear a mask and have to study at home, that, quite frankly, I really wish we could be in class right now. That would be a way more positive experience for all of us. Then, if you believe it's a hoax because of your negative feelings about the consequences, that's the fallacy of emotion. Often hear terrible things being justified by people's emotional response. It often doesn't come across to English audiences hearing Hitler shout on those old newsreels because it's almost so stereotypical. But if you translate his words, I've got it here. I'm acting today, acting in the sense of the Almighty Creator by warding off the Jews. I'm fighting for the Lord's work. Those were words that he knew his audience would respond emotionally positively to. Now, the coach giving the fantastic emotional speech just before the big game, we got to get out there and win. That's also an emotional response. Hopefully, it doesn't end up being horrible for everyone. You can use these fallacies for good. Suppose I use trigger your emotional responses to go out and be a better person. Should I do that? Right? It would seem that would be using poor logic to a good end. I'm not totally opposed to that. Next fallacy, appeal to force. This one's not in your textbook, So you have to rely on my notes and on any other source and I'll give you some links for more sources. But it's pretty simple. Ad baculum is the Latin, which is really baton or stick. And really, this is the literal description is, you know, if you don't agree with me, I'll hit you with a stick. And under those circumstances, you tend to get pretty agreeable. Of course, we have very subtle forms of force. The modern version of I'll hit you with a stick is I'm going to sue you, right? And the threat of prolonged legal proceedings are enough to cow most people into silence. Maybe you say something like, "Yeah, you should agree to my proposal," or "I'm going to let the tax auditors know that we've been doing business on the down low." That's a threat too. So anytime you make a threat as reason, if you make a threat as a premise, that is appeal to force. And counterexamples are easy here because there is nothing relevant to physical abuse, right? You should believe the world is flat or I'll beat you with a stick. A few years ago, we had a lot of fun in critical thinking class with some flat earthers that had come, they'd asked to come present to the class from some other faculty, and turned out that they were trying to find adherents for their flat earth theory, and we had tremendous fun with that, and it became the basis for the class project that year. No matter how many times someone whacks me with a stick, the world is not going to be flat. I'll post this link on YouTube on Trump threatening North Korea with fire and fury, that they should accept his proposals or I assume, he's threatening to bomb them. That's an interesting clip for a number of reasons, including his ridiculous body language, which is not threatening at all. But I'll leave that to your own look. Why is this persuasive? Well, let's face it. Fear and wanting to avoid pain and suffering is pretty effective. We don't want to suffer. We don't want to die. We don't want to lose what's important to us. And so if someone makes those threats, we tend to be pretty persuaded. When you make threats, as I think both President Trump and Vice President Biden are threatening essentially the same thing, that if the election doesn't go a certain way, it'll be the end of our country. That's exactly this fallacy, and they're both doing it, and probably pretty persuasive to segments of their own natural audiences. I think there's a very interesting tangent I want to take you down here, where some threats appear to be legitimate, and I think both Mr. Copey's textbook, The Standard, as well as the textbook we're using this year by Vaughan and McDonald, do a little bit of fancy dancing around the question of legitimate force, where you consider the threat implied by that sign. So, clearly that sign says to anyone who can read between the lines, if you drive too fast, we will give you a ticket. Now the sign, which is a threat, up and up, right? And the sign doesn't say, on the other hand, if you drive too fast, you statistically increase the chance that you're going to have, and these signs will have to be, every 100 meters down the highway, right? If you drive too fast, you statistically increase the chance of being involved in a significant accident that could result in injury or death, which would be more factually accurate, and the reason why we don't want people to drive too fast. But if those were the signs that were put up, people would drive too fast. Whereas when you put up a sign saying, drive too fast here and we're going to give you a ticket, people slow down. So now, is that a fallacy, or is that somehow okay, logically okay, because the person making the threat has authority to do so? Um, Now, I come down on this. It's still a fallacy. The fact that it's persuasive, and it's much more persuasive than treating people rationally, doesn't mean it's not a fallacy. All of these fallacies are enormously persuasive to vast numbers of people. Um, so I come down on this. When the police person says stop, or you'll be fined. Uh, there's no relevance between the fine and the action, apart from that's how society has chosen collectively to threaten each other in order to coerce behavior. It would be a much better world in which people would go, oh, you don't want me to do that because it could have negative consequences? Enough said. That's all I need to know. I will, now that I know that speeding is dangerous, I will drive at the appropriate speed from now on. That's just not human nature. And instead, if we want to influence human behavior, we threaten them. Pure and simple. Last one in this grab bag of fallacies is the irrelevant conclusion. Elenchi is the Latin and sometimes called non sequitur. Probably that's the more common name in Latin. Non sequitur, literally that means doesn't follow. So these are arguments where the premises don't follow from the conclusion, but tend not to have any of the other characteristics of the other 6 fallacies. The example given here, the ground zero mosque should be built because it is legal to build it. Now, that was a controversy for another time, but I think it's a cool example because President Obama, who normally is a pretty sharp and logical guy, is doing a little bit of a bait and switch here. The question of whether something's legal and whether it is should in any sort of moral imperative is pretty questionable. I would say there's a lack of relevance there. I won't go through this whole. I guess this is another thing you could watch on YouTube on your own time. But this is essentially a joke, which is a non sequitur. Why would a Wookiee, an 8-foot tall Wookiee, want to live on Endor with 2 feet tall Ewoks? What does this have to do with this case? Nothing, right? And so it's an entirely non sequitur that if Chewbacca lives on Endor, you must acquit. There is no connection between Chewbacca and the innocence of the person on trial. But you get the jury thinking about, oh, you're right. It is crazy that Chewbacca comes from Endor. What's up with that? And you get them thinking about the truth or falsity of that. Then you get them kind of punch drunk about the real question. For the same reason, if you ever get involved in a career in sales and you take training as a salesperson, you'll be trained to always ask questions, the answer to which you presume will be yes. Walk into a car dealership, the first question you'll get is, are you here to buy a car? Well, no kidding. Is it a nice day? Would you like a coffee? We'll ask you lots of questions to which they hoping the answer is yes, building up momentum towards, once you're in the habit of saying yes, you're more likely to continue. If my advice, if you're shopping for a car or frankly anything else, say no every time. Are you here to buy a car today? No. Would you like coffee? No. Would you like to sit down? No. And you want the first yes to come out of the person selling you the car, not you. That's free advice outside the scope of the course. Why is this persuasive? We tend to judge arguments, and remember the discussion we had last time about, well, it wasn't really a discussion because it was a video, but I was imagining the questions you were having in your head. That valid and strong arguments don't have to be true. The structure of the argument can be good even if the premises are false. Yet the way we ordinarily judge whether we believe someone is not by the structure of the argument, which takes training to identify, right? You're not, very few of us in our heads have a whiteboard in our head that we're putting premise, conclusion. Instead, we go, yeah, I kind of agree with that. I kind of agree with that. Well, most of what he's saying is true, so I guess it's true. So if you have a non sequitur, that's where all the premises are true, a lot of people gets kind of sucked along to accepting the conclusion. And so that's to the extent that the non sequitur has any sort of coherent feature that they all have in common. It's that sort of true premises dragging you to a true conclusion, even though there's no relevance. So I'm in favor of legalizing marijuana. After all, it is not as dangerous as smoking tobacco. Well, what relevance has that got with that? Maybe a more technical dogs and cats example. All cats are felines. All dogs are canines. Therefore, no dogs are cats. Notice that the two premises have nothing in common. That's about dogs. That's about cats. There's no relationship between those and the conclusion. A subcategory of the irrelevant conclusion is the red herring. And the red herring is the irrelevancy that's introduced deliberately. You're having an argument with maybe your significant other, and in response to the question, how to account for your time last night, you throw back a question about the person's housekeeping or their chore list isn't done. That's a red herring. You're trying to change the topic. In Canada, it's pretty common if you ever watch Question Period. Someone will stand up and say, "Will the Prime Minister explain why on earth we're not giving more funding to schools?" And the Prime Minister will stand up and say, "Well, and start to talk about this government's fiscal program has never been better, and exports are increasing, imports are decreasing, our economy is strong." Never answered the question. All of those topics, economy, imports, exports, red herrings. Our friend, Mr. Trump, this is his favorite move, of course, right? He seems like he's in trouble for one thing. He'll get on Twitter and say something horribly outrageous. And now we're all talking about that. And we've forgotten about the previous scandal. Whether that's working for him in the long run, it remains to be seen. But red herring is, people will talk about is the art of distraction. That's exactly what these red herrings are. The name comes from, I think this is an apocryphal story, but we can imagine it's true, that people being on the run, whether it be prisoners or slaves, have escaped, and in order to throw off the tracking dogs, would drag behind in their trail a fish, probably a stinky one, and then at some opportune moment throw the fish to the side of the trail, and then carry on, hoping that the bloodhounds would follow the smell of the fish rather than the smell of the person. So it's the deliberate distraction, the throwing away from the trail you want to follow a bait. Maybe we'll only do one of these examples, but looking at this one, I think there's great merit in making the requirements stricter for the graduate students. This is clearly a discussion at some university somewhere. I recommend that you support it too. After all, we're in a budget crisis and we do not want our salaries affected. Notice the budget crisis and salaries have nothing to do with the graduate students' requirements. Now, this example's, I want to illustrate a couple things here. First of all, I think this is clearly a red herring. We have deliberate distractions introduced into the argument. On the other hand, there's a little bit of a threat here too, isn't there? We don't want our salaries affected. Seems like a pretty subtle threat of force. So maybe this is an ad baculum or a force fallacy as well. And this is the point I want to make, that these fallacies sometimes are two fallacies in one. Sometimes they're halfway between two fallacies. Sometimes that what makes them even better is when there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Like I said, these are all rational mistakes. This is not doing it right, even if it is still convincing. And so you can get, so it's pretty common by now, if this were a live class, for students to say, I heard my crazy uncle say this, and I think it's these three fallacies. And yeah, it could be. Usually, typically, I like to sort of say, well, which is the main one? And then are there other ones kind of nested inside? So in my opinion, this clearly is new distractions brought in, red herring. But the fact that one of those distractions has a sort of threatening aspect to it, well, that's a little bit of spice on the cake, okay? And often these fallacies work that way. In U.S. elections, where they allow questions on the ballot, and not only you're voting for your government, but you're also making choices. And there's a lot of political maneuvering about making sure certain choices are on the ballot to motivate people to come and vote, and also to get you in a certain headspace as you're voting. If you were asked to increase your taxes, to reduce your services, and maybe even have some euthanasia on your ballot, and then you're asked, now who are you going to vote for? And those questions are, you've just thought about those things. That might influence your choices as to who you're going to pick in the election. Another subcategory is the straw man. And this is fun in a whole bunch of ways. The straw man is what you see there, the scarecrow, the weak opponent, the opponent who can't fight back. And so what we mean when we call something a straw man fallacy is when you deliberately mischaracterize the argument of the person you disagree with because in a way that makes it easier to refute. So here we have in the cartoon, we have who I presume is Mr. Obama. My opponent would like you to believe that our healthcare system is perfect the way it is. And then he's characterizing the opposition as no to good stuff. Well, that would be no to good stuff as a campaign platform would be pretty weak. And so that's exactly straw man. You're setting up an imaginary opponent who's much weaker than your actual one. So in something like the abortion debate, I warned you we'd get into some fun controversy this year. So if you were to take this position, and I'll quote, people who think abortion should be banned have no respect for the rights of women. They treat them as nothing but baby-making machines. That's wrong. Women must have the right to choose. Now, that seems like a very extreme position that actual pro-life advocates are probably not taking, especially the nothing but machines aspect of that seems a bit harsh. But notice that if you convince your audience that that's what your opponent believes, it's going to be pretty easy to take them down. Um, so now, how do we decide whether something's a straw man? And that really comes to reasonable interpretation. Are we understanding others fairly, or are we misconstruing? And so the guide here is what we call the principle of charity. And this is a rule of thought which requires you to interpret the arguments of others in the most reasonable or the most cogent way possible. And that's a high standard, actually. You might be discussing something with someone who clearly doesn't have it all together. And yet you should, to conform to the principle of charity, uh, take their argument on its best possible face, perhaps even better than they themselves can present. In debating, if you ever do technical debating, you score a ton of points for making a better case than your opposition did for their position. Say, what my opponent should have said is this very eloquent argument, and here's why that's wrong. Boy, have you got something that the judges will take notice of. So here's an interesting case, a bit dated, but it is what it is. So we had a guy who at the time was, I think, the Prime Minister of Canada's Chief of Staff, a guy named Tom Flanagan, and who suggested on Canadian news that when he was interviewed, that President Obama should put out a contract and maybe use a drone. Maybe he should be assassinated. And this is when the WikiLeaks affair was undergoing, and I guess Julian Assange is either a folk hero or a folk enemy, depending on what side of that you're on. And suggested, well, if the guy disappeared, I wouldn't be unhappy. Sounds like the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff is advocating for murder, or is he just really, really unhappy? Like, I think there's two possible interpretations there. I would call this the hyperbolic interpretation. He's not happy. It's a major breach of security for Canada and the U.S. And people who knew Flanagan thought that was a great guy with strong opinions, not a mean guy with lunatic opinions. Is how people who thought Flanagan was just really mad, and we've probably all made threats we don't really intend to live up to, or is he literally advocating for murder? And no doubt, at least for partly political reasons, the opposition party made complaints regarding a declaration to incite violence. And so if you took him literally, you would say he actually was saying that someone should kill somebody. That's a crime. If on the other hand you're saying, I'm really mad about that, so mad that I'll make these crazy threats, then that's a hyperbolic interpretation. Now, which is the charitable interpretation? I would suggest that even though Tom Flanagan's no friend of mine, the most reasonable interpretation is the one that doesn't have him be crazy, right? So the hyperbolic interpretation in this case is the better interpretation. That's the end of Fallacies of Relevance. There's exercises on page 63 and following, double F following, for you to have a look at, and make sure that this set of fallacies you get under your belt. And next time we'll pick up with fallacies of presumption.